Have you ever asked yourself, what did a day in the life of a Spartan boy actually look like? Forget Lego sets or Oreo cookies. In Sparta, childhood meant hunger, beatings, and if you were unlucky, being discarded at birth. Creepy enough. That was only the beginning. Welcome to a strange, unsettling journey through history, one where you'll laugh bitterly, shiver a little, and come away with more bizarre facts than you bargained for. I promise you this, by the end, your brain will be so full of strange Spartan details that falling asleep will be easy, not from boredom, but because Sparta is so extreme, so brutal, that you'll need time to let it all sink in. Across 7 chapters, we'll push open the dark doors of Spartan boyhood, from the ruthless rituals that decided which newborns lived or died, to being torn from their families and thrown into the infamous Agoge system where hunger, whippings, and psychological games were just daily routine. We'll see how boys learned to steal to survive, endure pain without a single tear, and participate in customs that most Western history books politely ignore. And finally, we'll see how Sparta, long gone as a state, it still haunts human imagination more than 2,000 years later. This isn't just a dry history lesson, it's a mystery tour where you'll chuckle at the absurdity one moment and get chills the next. And I'll bet that once this video ends, you'll never look at Sparta the same way again. So, before we step into the shadows and secrets of Sparta, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because you're not just watching a video, you're joining an expedition where every step uncovers a truth your school textbooks never dared to mention. What kind of society looks at a newborn baby, teeny fragile, still red from its first breath, and immediately asks, should we keep it or throw it away? That's not a horror movie plot. That was real life in Sparta, the ancient Greek city-state famous for warriors who feared nothing. In Sparta, being alive wasn't a birthright, it was your very first test to prove you were worthy of being called a Spartan. From the moment of birth, a Spartan infant wasn't placed in its mother's arms for cuddles. Instead, it was carried outside and presented to the community. Waiting there was a council of elders, grizzled old men hardened by battle. Not doctors, not kindly midwives, but Sparta's unofficial quality control committee. They inspected the baby like you'd inspect a young horse. Was its spine straight? Were its limbs strong? Did it look healthy enough to one day become a soldier? If the baby passed the test, congratulations, where it got to live, only to be taken away a few years later for brutal training. But if the council decided the child was weak or flawed, the verdict was cold and simple. The infant was carried to a nearby chasm called the apotheke and left to die of hunger, exposure, or wild animals. In Sparta, natural selection wasn't a scientific concept, it was official state policy. Why so cruel? Because Sparta lived by a single obsession: survival through strength. A weak citizen wasn't just a burden on the family, it was a potential liability to the phalanx, the dense battle formation of Greek soldiers. When your city was constantly afraid of being surrounded by enemies, compassion didn't make the list of priorities. In a way, Sparta nationalized Darwinism 2,500 years before Darwin himself. But is there proof this actually happened? Or is it just legend? Ancient historians like Plutarch wrote about this ritual in his Life of Lycurgus. Lycurgus, the semi-mythical lawgiver of Sparta, was said to have created most of the city's bizarre rules. According to Plutarch, parents had no say. The baby's fate belonged to the community. In other words, children were seen as the property of the state, a kind of collective parenthood, centuries before the concept even existed. To be fair, some modern historians doubt whether this practice was as widespread or systematic as the sources suggest. It could have been exaggerated, or even propaganda to make Sparta look terrifying. But whether myth or reality, the idea stuck. For centuries, Western imagination has pictured Sparta as a place where human life only mattered if it served war. And that image, a baby left on a cliff, has haunted us for thousands of years. Notice the contrast. Athens, Sparta's great rival, celebrated philosophy, art, and democracy. Sparta, by comparison, treated children as raw material for its war machine. Two Greek city-states, two completely different visions of humanity. Athens produced Socrates. Sparta produced Leonidas, and there was a political twist too. By taking away parental authority, Sparta sent a clear message: your child doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the state. If the elders approved, the baby became a strategic asset for the nation. If not, it was simply defective stock. There's a bitter irony here. Today, modern societies pride themselves on healthcare, social safety nets, and slogans like "no one left behind." Sparta ran on the opposite motto: only the strong survive. And while brutal, this system forged a society so disciplined that even mighty Rome respected it. The cost, however, was a civilization stripped of tenderness. So imagine it. Dawn breaks over a Spartan home. A baby's first cry fills the air. The mother, exhausted, feels not joy but dread. Not because of childbirth pain, but because she knows her child's life now depends on the verdict of stern old men outside. The father stands silent, his opinion irrelevant. When the elder finally declares, "This one will live," relief mixes with fear, because everyone knows survival was just step one in a long, bloody road ahead. And if the verdict went the other way, there was no Hollywood drama, no tragic funeral with mournful music, Just a cold decision, and another baby gone swallowed by silence, erased from the community's memory. That was life in Sparta. Even your very first breath was a trial. And from that moment, the wheel of survival began turning, dragging Spartan boys toward the most infamous training system in all of antiquity, the Agoge. But that's a story for the next chapter. How do you raise a child when your entire society doesn't see him as your baby, but as government property like a future piece of military equipment? And what happens when bedtime lullabies are replaced with orders, bruises, and hunger? Welcome to the first years of a Spartan boy's life, where even his toys felt more like training weapons than childhood fun. Let's rewind to the very beginning. Right after the infamous baby inspection we explored earlier, if an infant survived that ruthless selection process where elders decided whether he was strong enough to live, the real journey began. But don't imagine a warm, cozy family life filled with hugs and nursery rhymes. Sparta wasn't built for that. The role of a Spartan mother was less cuddly, caregiver, and more tough personal trainer. Women in Sparta had a reputation across Greece for being unusually bold and independent, while women in Athens were kept at home, spinning wool and barely seen in public. Spartan women ran estates, exercised in public, and even hurled witty insults at men during festivals. And yes, they trained their children with the same iron will. Imagine a Spartan mom rocking her baby not with a lullaby, but with motivational shouts like, "Grow strong, little one," or "The state will throw you off a cliff." Sounds harsh. That was the reality. Spartan society believed coddling weakened children. They wanted tough, resilient bodies from day one. Babies were often bathed in wine rather than water. Why? Because they thought wine would toughen the skin and reveal hidden weaknesses. If a baby got sick or convulsed, it was taken as proof that he wasn't fit to live. Congratulations. You just failed the world's most extreme wellness spa for infants. And as those children grew into toddlers, the line between play and preparation blurred. In most households today, toddlers get plush toys, Legos, maybe a toy car. In Sparta, your toy might be a small shield or a stick that doubled as a training spear. That was childhood entertainment, mock combat, chasing rough games designed to toughen muscles and test endurance. In short, while other kids played tag, Spartan kids played who survives with fewer bruises. But here's where the story twists again. In those first few years, despite all the toughness, Spartan boys still lived with their families. They ate at home, played around their villages, and were raised mostly by mothers and helots. Now helots were essentially enslaved farmers, people conquered by Sparta and forced to work the land. While they tilled fields and brought in food, Spartan families could focus on raising the next generation of warriors. So yes, the glorious Spartan childhood was partly made possible by an exploited underclass. The entire military machine depended on it. A 5-year-old Spartan boy might not understand politics, but he already benefited from the brutal system still. There must have been fleeting moments of normal childhood, laughing with siblings, tugging on their mother's dress, or sitting by a hearth fire. But everyone knew these moments had an expiration date, because around the age of 7, the clock struck midnight, childhood ended, and here comes the big moment: separation. At 7 years old, Spartan boys were ripped away from their families and delivered into the state's hands. Imagine being a modern parent, sending your kid to summer camp and then being told, "Actually, you'll never see your child again, except during rare visits. They belong to us now." That was the Spartan system. This transition wasn't subtle, it was formal, almost ritualistic. The boy left his household, packed his few belongings, if you could call them that, and joined a group of other children under the supervision of an older youth. No weeping farewells. No, "I'll miss you, honey." Spartan mothers were famous for their cold stoicism. One legend has a mother telling her son before battle, "Come back with your shield door on it." That attitude started here. A Spartan mom didn't cry when her child left. She probably said something like, "Don't embarrass the family." From that moment, the boy no longer belonged to his parents. He belonged to Sparta. And this is where the notorious Agoge begins. But before we dive into that hellish institution in the next chapter, let's pause to look at what this separation meant. First, it wasn't just physical, it was psychological. By cutting ties so early, Sparta effectively rewired loyalty. A boy's primary bond was no longer his biological family, but the collective, the state, his age group, his future It's a bit like a cult, but with more swords and fewer inspirational posters. Second, it was equalizing. Every boy, no matter if his father was a king or a farmer, went through the same process. Well, sort of. Spartan kings' sons had prestige, but they still entered the Agoge. The message was clear: no one is above the system. Everyone bleeds the same, sweats the same, and if unlucky, starves the same. Now, for us in the 21st century, this sounds shocking. Imagine telling an American or European parent, at 7, your child stops being yours. No more bedtime stories. No more family dinners. Instead, the government raises them in barracks, teaching obedience, endurance, and cruelty. Can you picture the outrage? PTA meetings would turn into riots. Lawsuits would fly. But in Sparta, this was the proud core of society. People believed it produced the strongest warriors on earth. And in some sense it worked. But let's not sugarcoat it. For the children themselves, this was terrifying. Imagine being 7 years old, dragged from your mother's arms, and forced into a barracks where older boys might beat you for training. Your toys replaced by real weapons. Your meals replaced by rations deliberately too small, so you'd learn to steal food without getting caught. That's the next chapter, but it all began with this moment of forced separation. And here's a little irony to chew on. Today we worry about attachment parenting, helicopter moms, and whether screen time is too high. Spartan parents, their biggest parenting hack was letting the state kidnap their children. Parenting solved. To understand why they accepted this, you have to grasp the Spartan worldview. They saw themselves as a tiny elite, a minority ruling over tens of thousands of helots who outnumbered them massively. Fear of rebellion was constant. So, to maintain dominance, Spartans couldn't afford soft boys. They needed every male citizen to be forged into an unbreakable soldier. Family affection had to be sacrificed on the altar of collective survival. And here's a final twist for you. While boys were taken, Spartan girls stayed home. But don't imagine a gentle domestic life for them. Girls trained touring, wrestling, even throwing javelins because Spartans believed strong women produced strong sons. If that sounds like proto-feminism, well, it kind of was. Spartan women were freer and more outspoken than almost any other women in ancient Greece. But their freedom existed only to serve the state's obsession, creating perfect warriors. So picture it. A 7-year-old boy, eyes wide with fear, clutching a tiny wooden shield. His mother doesn't cry. His father doesn't intervene. The elders nod approvingly, and as he marches off with his new age group, childhood ends. The family door closes, and the barracks door opens. Behind that door lies the Agoge, a brutal system of training that will starve him, beat him, test him, and if he's lucky transform him into the kind of soldier who makes Sparta's enemies tremble. What happens inside that door? That, my friends, is where the real nightmare begins. What kind of education system teaches kids to steal, beat each other up, and starve and still has historians praising it as the pinnacle of discipline? That's the Agoge, Sparta's infamous boot camp for boys, where childhood was basically cancelled, and survival was the only subject on the curriculum. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were yanked out of their homes and thrown into this state-run machine. Imagine little Timmy being told to pack his teddy bear because tomorrow he's moving into a military barracks. Except no teddy bears, no comfort, no kisses goodnight. Their mothers handed them over with a cold stare and that unforgettable motto, "Come back with your shield," or "on it," which basically meant, win or die. Sweetie, you can almost hear the lullabies in the background, right? So what did daily life inside the Agoge look like? Let's start with food. Because if there's one universal truth across history, it's that kids are always hungry. Except in Sparta, hunger wasn't a bug, it was the system. Meals were deliberately small, bland, and boring. A black broth made of pig's blood, vinegar, and a sprinkle of despair. It was said visitors gagged at the taste, while Spartans claimed it made them tough. But of course, the point wasn't attrition. It was scarcity. Hunger taught boys to steal food. And when they stole, they had to be clever. If they succeeded, congratulations, they survived another day. If they got caught, they weren't punished for stealing. They were punished for being sloppy. The message was clear. In Sparta, incompetence hurt more than crime. This idea bled into everything else. Fighting wasn't a weekend hobby. It was the core of their lives. Older boys were encouraged no order to beat up younger ones. Think of it as a brutal mentorship program, where instead of tutoring in math, your big brother taught you how to take a punch without crying. Teachers, if we can even call them that, stood by and watched. Sometimes, they egged the beatings on because apparently nothing said character development like being pummeled by a kid 2 years older. And discipline. Oh, that was everywhere. Talking back, moving too slowly, showing too much emotion. Each of these could earn you a whipping, not from your parents but from state officials. In fact, there was an entire ritual where boys were whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia in front of cheering crowds. The goal? To see who could endure the longest without screaming. Imagine a school talent show, but instead of singing or juggling, the competition was who can bleed the most gracefully. But don't get me wrong, the Agoge wasn't all about breaking bones. It was also about shaping minds. Yes, they did learn reading and writing, but only the basics. Enough to follow orders, not enough to start questioning them. Philosophy, science, poetry, forget it. That was Athens' department. Spartans trained in something far more practical. Memory, obedience, and manipulation. They practiced speaking in short, cutting remarks, what we now call laconic wit. You know, those sharp one-liners that shut down a conversation? The Spartans invented that. It wasn't just sass, it was strategy. Fewer words meant fewer secrets spilled. Music and dance were also part of the training, but not for fun. The songs were military chants, designed to synchronize soldiers' movements and unify the group. Dance routines weren't about grace, but coordination. Picture a flash mob, except instead of surprising shoppers in a mall, the performance prepared you for synchronized killing on the battlefield. And then there was the Yes, little Spartan boys were basically trained as junior secret agents. Part of the Agoge involved sending them out into the countryside to stalk, observe, and sometimes even assassinate rebellious helots, the enslaved population that farmed Sparta's land. Imagine a 12-year-old given a knife and told, "Good luck, don't get caught." This wasn't Boy Scouts. This was state-sponsored terror training. All of this forged boys into warriors who were lean, mean, and terrifying. But at what cost? Childhood joy was non-existent. Friendships weren't based on trust, but on surviving ordeals together. And there's a darker layer. Historians whisper about the bonds formed between older and younger boys often went beyond mentorship. In a world where intimacy was twisted into another tool of control, even affection was militarized. The state encouraged these relationships, believing they built loyalty in battle. It's a detail often brushed aside in textbooks, but it tells us just how far Sparta blurred the line between the personal and the political. Now let's zoom out. Why did Sparta go to such extremes? Simple paranoia. They lived in constant fear of their own slaves, the helots, who outnumbered them 7-1. Every Spartan boy had to be forged into a soldier, because if they weren't, the entire system could collapse overnight. The Agoge wasn't about raising individuals, it was about manufacturing weapons with beating hearts. And here's the paradox. The system worked, at least for a while. By the time these boys became men, they were capable of facing armies twice their size without flinching. The Mutl, that legendary last stand against Persia, that was the Agoge's final exam played out on a world stage. The whole West remembers the 300 Spartans, but what we forget is that behind those men were boys who had endured years of hunger, humiliation, and violence to be ready for that moment. But while we admire their toughness, let's not romanticize it. This was a society that treated childhood as a liability, weakness as a crime, and compassion as a distraction. For every Spartan hero carved into legend, there were countless nameless boys who didn't make it through the Agoge alive. Their stories weren't written, because Sparta only remembered the strong dots, so the next time you hear someone casually say, "Spartans were so badass," remember what that really meant. 7-year-olds beaten until they couldn't cry. Teenagers starved until stealing became second nature. Boys turned into soldiers before they even had a chance to be children. It's impressive, yes, but it's also chilling. And perhaps the cruelest irony is this: the Agoge, designed to create the most fearsome warriors, also sowed the seeds of Sparta's downfall. By focusing everything on war, they neglected innovation, art, and diplomacy. They became excellent at fighting battles but terrible at surviving history. Yet their legend lives on. Why? Because we're drawn to extremes. The idea of a society that erased childhood and manufactured warriors fascinates us. It's brutal, it's alien, and it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What would we sacrifice for security? How much of our humanity are we willing to trade for strength? And so, as you drift to sleep tonight, let the image linger. A line of skinny, barefoot boys, marching in unison, faces hardened not by age, but by pain. Behind them, the faint sound of a drum, the smell of black broth, and the echo of a whip cracking in the distance. That was the Agoge, the school where survival was the only diploma, and the price of failure was your life. And that, my friends, was the Agoge machine designed to crush childhood and spit out fearless warriors. But hold on. Don't think for a second that what I just described is the full story. That was only the framework, the steel casing. We haven't yet opened the box to see the gears grinding inside. Because what you still haven't witnessed is a typical day for these boys. How exactly did they sleep? What passed for a meal? What kind of creative punishments did their instructors come up with? Punishments that make modern school detention look like a spa retreat. Was hunger just a rumbling stomach, or was it a deliberate tactic to train young minds to survive like castaways? Were the beatings simply mindless brutality, or a carefully staged ritual meant to hardwire obedience? And maybe most chilling, what did it do to a child's psyche when your classmates were simultaneously your comrades and the ones ordered to beat you bloody in front of the teacher? That's the door we're about to open in the next chapter. You'll walk alongside a Spartan boy from the moment he opens his eyes at dawn until he collapses on a hard wooden bed at night. Every drumbeat, every pitiful scrap of food, every lash of the whip, all of it will piece together into the portrait of a day in the life of Sparta, where childhood was basically one long, cruel joke. Are you sure you're ready to step through? Because once you hear it, you might never complain about your high school cafeteria food again. How do you measure the cost of becoming a Spartan warrior? Not by victories, not by statues, not even by scars. You measure it by a single day, because for a Spartan boy, every day was a carefully crafted crucible. Wake up, get broken down, rebuilt into steel, repeat. Childhood, forget it. That word did not exist in their vocabulary. So let's peel back the curtain on a typical day in the Agoge, the infamous training system that molded Sparta's children into soldiers. And trust me, once you've seen their daily routine, you'll stop complaining about your 6 a.m. alarm clock. Picture the dawn, not the cozy, Instagram-worthy sunrise with birds chirping and coffee brewing. No, this was Spartan dawn, cold, sharp, and merciless. The boys didn't wake up to a mother's gentle call or even a rooster crow. They woke up because a trainer, often an older Spartan youth already hardened by the system, would rattle them awake. Beds don't picture soft linen. The mattress was nothing more than reeds or a wooden plank, and even that was sometimes a luxury. Why? Because comfort was the enemy. If your body got used to softness, how could it endure the hard ground during war campaigns? So they learned to sleep rough, because life would only get rougher. Breakfast, that word barely applied here. Spartan meals were deliberately meager, designed to keep you lean and hungry. Their diet centered on barley bread, black broth, a legendary concoction of pork boiled in blood, vinegar, and salt. Yes, you heard right. And maybe, if fortune smiled, a few figs or cheese. Sounds revolting. That was the point. Hunger was not an accident. It was policy. The state believed that boys who lived with constant hunger would become crafty, resourceful, and resilient. And yes, stealing food was allowed, actually encouraged, but with one catch: if you got caught, you weren't punished for theft. You were punished for being clumsy enough to get caught. Imagine the life lesson. Sure, steal the chicken, but don't be stupid enough to trip over the coop. After this delightful breakfast of starvation, the boys' day truly began. Training, and more training. Physical drills were relentless. Running barefoot on rocky terrain, wrestling with peers until someone bled, throwing javelins, practicing formations, and no shoes. Spartans believed going barefoot made boys tougher, faster, and less dependent on luxuries. Archaeological evidence even suggests Spartan children went years without shoes or warm clothes, which might explain why every description of them mentions their almost unnatural endurance. To a modern parent, this sounds like child abuse. To the Spartans, it was patriotism. But the Agoge wasn't just about brute force. It was about forging obedience and cunning through pain. Whippings were common, not just for mistakes, but as routine exercises. At the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, there was even a public whipping ritual called diamastagosis. Teenagers were flogged before crowds, often to the point of fainting, sometimes to death, all in the name of proving toughness. And here's the twisted part. The audience cheered. Imagine your local high school pep rally, but instead of cheerleaders, you've got bleeding teenagers competing to see who can stay conscious the longest. That was Spartan entertainment. The psychological games were just as brutal. Instructors would pit boys against each other in fights, not for sport, but to foster rivalry and test loyalty. Sometimes, a boy would be ordered to beat his best friend or worse. Take the beating while his comrades watched. The message was clear. Personal bonds were secondary. Loyalty to the state was everything, and you thought middle school cliques were toxic. Even education was weaponized. Reading and writing were taught, but minimally. The emphasis was on brevity and sharpness, what we now call laconic wit, named after Laconia, the region of Sparta. The Spartans didn't do essays. They did one. The more cutting, the better. Think of it as ancient Twitter, 280 characters or less, but with life or death stakes. When Philip of Macedon once threatened to invade Sparta if they resisted him, the Spartan reply was a single word: if. That was their entire brand. Yet, oddly enough, the Agoge wasn't just about beating and starving kids. It also trained their minds in music, dance, and poetry, because rhythm and coordination were essential on the battlefield, and communal singing strengthened bonds. Think about it. Warriors marching in step, chanting together, wasn't just military precision, it was psychological warfare. The Spartans weaponized art, turning it into another form of discipline. It's almost poetic, in a terrifying way. And then there was the Cryptio, the secret police training. Part spy school, part horror story. Select older boys were sent into the countryside at night with knives, tasked with terrorizing or even killing helots, the enslaved population that farmed Spartan land. Historians debate whether this was a regular institution or more sporadic. But the message is chilling either way. Children were being hardened into assassins before they could shave. Imagine a summer camp where the nightly activity wasn't roasting marshmallows, but stalking peasants under cover of darkness. That was Sparta's version of a field trip. All of this was wrapped in an atmosphere of constant surveillance. Older boys, called arenas, were placed in charge of younger ones, enforcing rules with cruelty if necessary. Instructors watched everything, and failure was punished, not with encouragement but with humiliation or pain. The Agoge was less like a school and more like a prison camp with a curriculum. Every moment, every meal, every fight, every word was designed to serve one purpose: erase individuality and replace it with Spartan discipline. By sunset, the boys were exhausted, bruised, and still hungry. Dinner was no feast either, just another meager serving of black broth. And after that, more training, sometimes at night, because war didn't keep to business hours. Finally, when they did collapse into their hard beds, it wasn't restful sleep. It was a brief pause before the next dawn would rip them awake again. So what did a Spartan boy go through all day? Hunger, pain, humiliation, surveillance, and fear, but also discipline, resilience, and a terrifying kind of unity. The system was designed not to nurture, but to break, and then to rebuild. And it worked. By adulthood, these boys weren't just soldiers, they were living weapons. shaped by every scrap of food they didn't eat, every beating they endured, every word they kept sharp and short. It's tempting to laugh at the absurdity, huh? Imagine getting punished for getting caught stealing cheese. But there's a dark brilliance in the design. The Agoge turned survival into an education, cruelty into a curriculum, suffering into a national identity. And while the rest of Greece might mock Sparta's lack of philosophy, art, or luxury, when it came to producing warriors who could stand toe-to-toe with overwhelming odds, the system delivered. Yet the price was enormous. Childhood joy, personal freedom, even basic humanity was stripped away. That Agoge wasn't a school, it was a factory, and its only product was war. So next time you hit snooze on your alarm, complain about cafeteria food, or groan about gym class, just remember, at least no one's whipping you to death in front of your classmates. But here's the question we haven't answered yet. If every day was this brutal, how did it shape their sense of loyalty, friendship, and even love? When the only bond that mattered was to the state, what did that do to the bonds between the boys themselves? Was brotherhood a survival mechanism or something much darker? How do you make a boy love the state more than his own family? That's the central question of Spartan society, because by the time a Spartan child had survived the Agoge's whips, hunger, and sleepless nights, his education wasn't just about becoming tough, it was about becoming loyal, unshakably, dangerously loyal, to Sparta, to his comrades, to the state above all else. And if you think loyalty sounds like a noble virtue, just wait until you see how the Spartans twisted it into something both brilliant and terrifying. First, discipline. Discipline was the heartbeat of Sparta. A boy's life was governed by rules that were less like guidelines and more like iron chains. Talking out of turn, punished. Disobedience, punished harder. Even speaking too much was frowned upon. Spartans admired silence and brevity. Imagine a society where small talk was considered weakness. Birthday wishes, gossip, even "Hey, how's the weather?" would be seen as verbal clutter. The Spartan boy was trained to hold his tongue until every word was a weapon, short, sharp, and cutting. Their silence wasn't shyness, it was discipline forged into habit. But the deeper layer was obedience. Instructors, called paidonomoi, had absolute authority. They could beat any boy for any infraction, real or imagined. And it wasn't just adults enforcing discipline. Older boys were placed in charge of younger ones, creating a hierarchy of control. This peer policing wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. It meant that loyalty and obedience weren't just vertical, flowing from boy to state. They were horizontal, tying each boy to the comrades around him, a system so tight it left no room for individuality. Now, let's talk about loyalty. The Spartans engineered it with surgical precision. Stripped from their families at age 7, boys quickly learned that their new family was the herd of boys suffering beside them. Pain became the glue that bonded them together. Who else could understand the lash of the whip, the ache of an empty stomach, the humiliation of failure, except the boy next to you going through the same thing? Out of this shared misery grew loyalty so intense that betrayal of a comrade was unthinkable. And then comes the controversial part, the bonds of brotherhood. Ancient sources, like Xenophon and Plutarch, suggest that relationships between older and younger boys were sometimes even romantic or sexual ones. Historians debate how widespread this was, but here's the logic. If two warriors were bound by more than just training, if they were emotionally and perhaps physically tied together, they would fight harder to protect one another. Awkward for us to imagine today, absolutely. But in the Spartan mind, it wasn't scandal. It was strategy. They weaponized intimacy. This was loyalty built on multiple levels. Loyalty to the comrade, loyalty to the unit, loyalty to the state. And to test it, the Agoge devised cruel experiments. Boys were ordered to spy on each other, to report disobedience, to punish weakness. Imagine the paranoia. Your best friend might be your betrayer, and you might be forced to betray him in turn. Loyalty to the state always trumped loyalty to the individual, and yet somehow the bonds that survived this pressure became unbreakable. Even religion was bent into this system of loyalty. The boys marched and sang hymns together, their voices woven into a single rhythm. Music wasn't art for its own sake. It was synchronization, emotional conditioning. When they prayed to Artemis or Apollo, they did it as a group. You didn't pray for yourself, you prayed for Sparta. God wasn't just divine. God was state-approved morale. Now, what about consequences? In most societies, loyalty has wiggle room. You can love your country but still love your family more. You can respect the law but bend it for your children. In Sparta, there was no wiggle room. Boys were taught that betrayal of Sparta was worse than death. Cowards weren't just shamed, they were erased. One historical account tells us that Spartan men who fled in battle were forced to live on the margins of society, ridiculed and humiliated until they wished for death. Loyalty wasn't optional, it was survival. And here's where it gets even more chilling. This loyalty wasn't designed to end with childhood. Once they graduated from the Agoge at age 20, young men didn't run home to their families. No, they moved into mess halls called Syssitia communal dining groups where every man was required to eat with his comrades every single day. Miss a meal, you could lose your citizenship. Think about that. Even adulthood didn't free you from the web of discipline and loyalty spun in boyhood. Once a Spartan, always a cog in the Spartan machine. It's easy to mock this. Imagine being punished because you didn't show up for dinner with the boys. Or imagine growing up in a society where your best buddy might also be the state's spy keeping tabs on you. But the brilliance here is undeniable. The Spartans created warriors who didn't just fight, they fought with unflinching trust in the man next to them. In battle, a Spartan didn't worry if his comrade would run. He knew his comrade would die before breaking formation. That kind of loyalty is rare, and it's terrifying when weaponized. Yet let's not romanticize it too much. The same system that produced unbeatable unity also crushed individuality. There was no room for the dreamer, the rebel, the artist. If a boy showed too much independence, the system would grind it out of him. Yes, Sparta created the ultimate soldier, but at the cost of creating incomplete men. Men who could march, kill, and obey, but who left little else behind. No literature, no philosophy, no grand architecture. Just discipline, loyalty, and war. So what did discipline and loyalty mean for Spartan boys? It meant living in a constant state of fear and devotion. It meant that love was harnessed as a weapon, that friendship was forged in pain, that betrayal of the state was the unforgivable sin. It meant that when a Spartan mother handed her son a shield with the words "come back with it" or "on it," she wasn't exaggerating, she was speaking the literal truth of their world. And here's the irony. For all its cruelty, the system worked. Spartan armies, though small in number, were legendary for their unity. At Thermopylae, when 300 Spartans stood against thousands of Persians, it wasn't just muscle or weapons that gave them their edge. It was loyalty, the kind forged from stolen meals, shared beatings, whispered hymns, and the quiet, brutal rhythm of the Agoge. So next time you complain about team-building exercises at work, remember, at least your boss isn't flogging you into loyalty, or forcing you to eat pig's blood soup with your co-workers every night. But let's leave this chapter with a question. What is the price of such loyalty? For every Spartan who stood proud in battle, how many were broken in silence? For every bond that inspired courage, how many boys lost their chance at individuality, creativity, or freedom? Was the price worth it, or was it too high for a society that vanished into history? In the next chapter, we'll explore that cost, because discipline and loyalty sound heroic until you start counting the pain, trauma, and human lives chewed up by the machine. And in Sparta, the price of strength was always measured in suffering. How much pain can a society hide behind the mask of strength? That's the uncomfortable question when we look at Sparta. We celebrate their warriors, their discipline, their unbreakable shields and spears, but what about the scars they never showed? What about the losses buried beneath the polished bronze helmets? The truth is, Spartan strength came with a cost so high it almost makes you wonder whether the ideal warrior society was more tragedy than triumph. Let's start with the obvious pain. The Agoge was designed to manufacture it. Hunger wasn't an accident, it was policy. Whippings weren't punishments, they were training exercises. Imagine being beaten, not because you disobeyed, but because your instructors wanted to see if you could endure. And if you didn't, you weren't just weak, you were a disgrace. Failure wasn't about the body, it was about your very worth as a Spartan. But the pain wasn't only physical. The emotional wounds ran deeper. Taken from their families at age 7, Spartan boys were taught early that affection was weakness. Mothers were expected to love their sons fiercely but never show it. Fathers were encouraged to be distant, almost absent. The message was clear. Your first loyalty is not to family but to Sparta. Imagine the silence in those homes. No bedtime stories, no comforting hugs, just the quiet knowledge that the state owned your child more than you did. And then there's the haunting ritual of flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Every year, Spartan boys were whipped in front of crowds, sometimes to the point of death, as a religious spectacle. The idea was that enduring pain honored the goddess and proved devotion to Sparta. But think about it. Public child abuse as entertainment, applauded by citizens. Historians record that mothers sometimes encouraged their sons to endure longer, even if it killed them, because death with honor was better than survival with shame. That's not just pain, that's cultural brainwashing on a terrifying scale. Now, let's talk about loss. For every Spartan warrior who returned with his shield or on it, how many never returned at all? Sparta's population was tiny, maybe 8,000 citizens at its peak. By the time of the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, that number had dwindled to less than 1,500. The endless wars, the constant training, the brutal discipline, it all chipped away at their numbers. Sparta didn't collapse because they lost a war. They collapsed because they lost too many people. And don't forget the women. Spartan women are often romanticized as unusually free and strong compared to other Greek women. True, they had more rights, they owned land, they managed the states, they even exercised and trained their bodies. But that freedom came with its own price. Women were expected to bear strong children, nothing less. If a woman couldn't, she was seen as a failure. Her worth wasn't in her mind or her spirit, but in her womb. And when her sons were taken away, her role was to harden her heart. Come back with your shield, or on it. That famous line wasn't a joke, it was a demand. Imagine a mother forced to celebrate her son's death because to mourn would dishonor him and herself. The price of Spartan strength was also cultural emptiness. While Athens produced plays, philosophy, art, and democracy, Sparta produced silence. They left us almost no literature, no architecture beyond their stern temples, no great works of art. Their one true export was war, and when the wars ended, when their numbers dwindled, they had nothing left. A society built only for killing will eventually run out of things to kill, and then what remains? Just ruins and ghost stories. But perhaps the most chilling cost was psychological. Imagine being conditioned from childhood to suppress fear, grief, love, and doubt. Spartans were told that emotions were dangerous luxuries, crying forbidden, questioning authority, fatal individual dreams. Erased. By the time a Spartan boy became a man, his inner life had been stripped down to one purpose: serve the state. Was that strength, or was it a kind of slavery dressed in armor? The irony is sharp. We admire Spartan courage at Thermopylae, but rarely ask what kind of life produces men who can march into certain death without hesitation. It's the kind of life where death is preferable to shame, where individuality is crushed, where your body is the state's property, not your own. Yes, the Spartans achieved greatness, but only by sacrificing almost everything else that makes life rich, joyful, and human. Let's not forget the helots, the enslaved population that made Spartan society possible. For every Spartan warrior, there were 7 helots toiling in the fields, growing the food, and enduring brutal oppression. Spartans ritually declared war on them every year, giving themselves license to kill without guilt. Spartan boys were even sent out to assassinate helots as part of their training. Think about that, a society that maintained its freedom by practicing systematic terror on its slaves. The price of Spartan strength wasn't just paid by Spartans themselves, it was paid by thousands of people condemned to live and die in subjugation. And here's the ultimate paradox. All this sacrifice, all this pain, all this discipline, and yet Sparta still fell. At Leuctra, when Thebes shattered their army, all the suffering of generations collapsed in a single day. Their legendary warriors couldn't stop the decline. Their iron discipline couldn't shield them from the slow erosion of their population. Their system had produced the world's best soldiers, but it couldn't sustain a living, breathing society. So what's the lesson? Maybe that the price of strength is too high when it costs you your humanity. Sparta's obsession with military perfection gave us legends, yes, but also cautionary tales. They remind us that a society can look powerful on the outside while rotting within, that discipline can become cruelty, that loyalty can become slavery, that strength can become fragility when pushed too far in the end. Sparta is a paradox wrapped in bronze. They were both inspiring and horrifying, both strong and fatally weak. They gave us stories of heroism that echo through history, but they also remind us that behind every legend are countless silent victims, forgotten pains, and hidden losses. So next time someone says, we should be more like Sparta, maybe ask them, do you really want the strength, if it means paying this price? In the final chapter, we'll step back and look at the legacy. Because even though Sparta is gone, their image haunts the West, from Renaissance painters to modern military boot camps, from movies like 300 to political slogans. Sparta may have died, but their myth never did. And maybe that's the strangest price of all, being remembered not as you truly were, but as the legend others wanted you to be. What happens when a civilization dies, but its ghost refuses to leave? That's the story of Sparta. The city itself crumbled, its warriors vanished, its laws turned to dust, but the myth of Sparta, that survived. In fact, it thrived. From Renaissance paintings to Hollywood blockbusters, from military academies to motivational gym posters, the Spartans became more famous in death than they ever were in life. The irony, of course, is that much of what we know about Sparta comes from outsiders. They left us almost no writing of their own. Most of the stories we tell about Thermopylae, about their discipline, about their mothers and their shields, were written by Athenians, Persians, or later historians who were fascinated by these strange people who lived without luxury, without poetry, without art. In other words, Sparta's legacy is a mirror. We see in them not who they were, but what we want them to represent. Take the Renaissance. European thinkers rediscovered the classics and fell in love with Sparta's simplicity. They contrasted it with decadent Athens, praising Spartan austerity as a kind of moral purity. Never mind that the Spartans depended on brutal slavery. The myth was cleaner than the truth. And so, for centuries, Sparta became shorthand for virtue through discipline. Fast forward to the Enlightenment, and suddenly political philosophers used Sparta as their laboratory. Jean-Jacques Rousseau admired their collective loyalty. Others saw in them the dangers of too much conformity. Sparta became a cautionary tale and a utopian dream at the same time, a society stripped down to the bone, where individual desires were crushed in the name of the whole. But the real explosion of the Spartan myth came in modern times. In the 19th century, when nationalism surged across Europe, Sparta was reborn as the ultimate model of military sacrifice. The Battle of Thermopylae, just 300 men facing the Persian army, became the poster child for patriotic death. The message was irresistible: better to die gloriously than to live dishonorably. Armies across Europe invoked the Spartans. Even Hitler's Germany admired them as the archetype of racial purity and military discipline. It was propaganda gold. And then came the 21st century and Hollywood. The movie 300 turned Leonidas and his warriors into pop culture superheroes, complete with abs so sculpted they might as well have been CGI. The film simplified the story into a tale of freedom versus tyranny, ignoring the messy parts like the fact that Sparta itself was built on oppression. But no one cared. The legend sold. Jim Brothers shouted, "This is Sparta," while doing death. Military boot camps plastered Thermopylae quotes on their walls. The Spartan brand became one of the most profitable in history. But here's the haunting part. The real Sparta might not have liked this legacy. Their actual society wasn't glamorous. It was grim. Their discipline wasn't about heroism. It was about survival. Their greatness wasn't eternal. It collapsed within a few centuries. Yet the world prefers the legend, the fearless warrior, the iron discipline, the noble death. We crave simple stories, and Sparta gave us one of the simplest of all. And yet, their influence isn't just about war. Modern sports borrow from their ideals. Think about the word Spartan race, a grueling obstacle course where you crawl through mud and climb ropes. The name isn't an accident. It's designed to make suffering feel noble. Minimalism too often uses Spartan as a compliment. Bare rooms, hard beds, no luxuries. We call that stylish now. To the Spartans, it was just life. But let's not forget the darker side of the legacy. Sparta has been used by extremists to glorify violence, to justify authoritarianism, to idolize strength over compassion. The same myths that inspire athletes also inspire dangerous ideologies. When you reduce a civilization to a symbol, you can twist that symbol into whatever shape you want. And that is exactly what's happened with Sparta for 2,000 years. So what does Sparta really teach us? Maybe that legends are stronger than facts. The Spartans themselves vanished, but the stories about them only grew. They remind us that history is never just about what happened, it's about how we choose to remember it. And in remembering, we often erase the pain, the cruelty, the complexity. We trade the messy truth for a shiny myth. Still, there's something undeniably magnetic about Sparta. They force us to ask hard questions. How much freedom would you give up for safety? How much individuality for unity? How much humanity for strength? They answered those questions with their lives, and their answer still echoes in our thoughts. So, as the video fades, picture those stone ruins in Laconia, quiet, empty, surrounded by olive trees. No more warriors, no more chants, no more shields clashing, just silence. And yet, across the world, their name still roars. Sparta, not the place, not the people, but the myth. And that's the strangest part of all. A society that stripped itself of everything out comfort. Even love ended up giving us something they never intended, a story we can't stop telling. If you've stayed with me all the way through, thank you. You've just walked through the rise, the pain, the discipline, the collapse, and finally the ghost of Sparta. If you want more journeys like this, more myths, more forgotten empires, more uncomfortable truths dressed as bedtime stories, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and join me next time. Because history doesn't sleep, and neither do the legends we keep alive.